Well, hello there, everyone. It's me, Mr. Macaluso. Today we're going to talk about the Roaring Twenties and what a wonderful time it was. A golden epoch, a beautiful era. Yes, we had it easy back in the 1920s. And today we're going to talk about that. First thing I'd like to talk about is the political scene of the 1920s. After the solemn referendum of 1920, Warren G. Harding became the president, and he was the beginning of a line of Republican presidents, each one more conservative than the next. Now, Warren G. Harding wasn't considered a very great president. He, as I said before, was enmeshed in scandal. He died in office. He was elected in 1920, after all. Burst appendix, they say. Some say that his wife poisoned him while he was on a trip to Alaska because of an affair. After Warren G. Harding, we had Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal. You may have heard of Silent Cal. The story about Silent Cal goes like this. One day, a Washington socialite was having the president over for a party. And she and her friends had a little wager on the president. As his moniker suggests, Silent Cal didn't have a lot to say. And she bet her best friends that she could get him to say at least 3 words at her party. So the day of the party came and President Coolidge showed up. It was a grand affair. I wasn't there. I was traveling overseas at the time. But as the president got up to leave at the end of the evening, he, of course, had to give his respects to his hostess. And so he walked up to her on his way out the door, and he said to her, "You lose," and walked out. I don't know if that's a true story, but it's a good story. After Silent Cal, who was from Vermont, of all places, after Silent Cal, we get Herbert Hoover. A little bit of alliteration going on in our president names back then. Now, Herbert Hoover, unlike Harding, was considered possibly the most qualified man to ever run and win the presidency. He was an international businessman. He was trained as an engineer. During World War I, he led a massive relief effort to save the starving Belgians. After the Germans invaded, Belgium wasn't doing very well, and Herbert Hoover was credited with saving hundreds of thousands of lives. He knew how the world worked. He knew how the economy worked. He was scientifically minded. Here was a man who was prepared for the presidency. And he inherits one of the greatest economies ever. Truly, this is true. The 1920s were a boom time in America. And Herbert Hoover steps into a great economy. In fact, he's elected, by the way, in 1928. And in 1929, the beginning of 1929, he says, prosperity is here to stay. Of course, things didn't work out for Herbert Hoover. Now, I say that they're conservatives, okay? And here's what I mean. These 3 presidents, unlike Woodrow Wilson, really believed in what we call laissez-faire government. Laissez-faire is a French term meaning let do. We usually translate it to mean hands off. So what does this mean? Well, do you recall during the populist era and the progressive era, we saw the federal government doing more and more regulation of big business? You'll recall under Woodrow Wilson, the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Federal Trade Commission were both enacted. Well, these 3 presidents want to get rid of all government regulation. They believe that the market will have all the solutions that we need, that governments just get in the way and cause trouble. So therefore, they reduce the level of government regulation of all businesses and of the entire economy. Okay? Now, big corporations love this. This means higher profits. They also cut taxes on the very wealthy. Of course, big business loves that as well, right? We're pretty much going back to the Gilded Age period. They're going to raise tariffs. How many times have we going to talk about tariffs in this class? Well, you'll recall that Wilson tried to reduce tariffs, which hurt big industry, but helped the middle-class consumer. So this is the broad agenda for these conservative Republican presidents. Furthermore, we have an era of mass consumerism. Now, what do I mean by that? Because we have this rising middle class, more and more people are buying things, right? The middle class has a disposable income. They can buy things, and as they do, the economy gets better and better, okay? Now, some of the reasons for this mass consumerism is this. Believe it or not, psychology is a relatively new field of study. Sigmund Freud, probably the granddaddy of all psychology, was really working at the turn of the century. And what do you think advertisers have seen that they like about psychology? They realize that you can use a lot of psychological principles to, some would say manipulate, others would say convince, people to buy things. Okay? So this is an era of advertising, and advertising does what it advertises it's going to do. It gets people to buy things. If you look at the screen, we have this new form of advertising. You note Babe Ruth in the picture for Red Rock Cola, 5 cents a bottle. Babe Ruth is a celebrity. He's a sports hero. This is the era of sports heroes. Babe Ruth being one of the greatest. And if you can associate your cola with a famous guy like Babe Ruth, well, you're going to get people to drink that Red Rock Cola. Maybe that'll give you a couple extra hits at bat if you are a young ball player. Okay, so advertising is really important. Department store catalogs are a new thing. Now, you probably get a lot of mail order catalogs these days. Maybe you got your last J. Crew catalog recently. But the idea of a mail order catalog is relatively new. Sears, Roebuck and Company was probably the largest mail order catalog of the 20s. And you could buy anything, it seems like, in a Sears Roebuck catalog. You could even buy a house. It was a house, a prefabricated house that would be shipped to you in boxes, and you'd put it together yourself. That's amazing, isn't it? So it's easier and easier for people to buy stuff. Think of these catalogs as the internet of the day, right? Today we can click away and buy whatever we want without having to leave our house. Back then, the idea is you can mail away for just about anything you want to buy. Now, excuse me, I seem to be getting a phone call here. Mr. Madsen.
Well,
is that you?
Howdy.
Mr. Madsen, where are you coming from?
Well, my friend, I am, at least in my imagination, bowling along down the Mississippi.
Really?
I am. That's why you can hear can you hear the hillbilly music in the background?
I'm sorry, I'll have to turn the jazz down here on my end.
Yeah, I'm still in the 1840s. You know, I'm enjoying life along the Mississippi with Huck and Jim and the color of the region.
Very nice, very nice. Well, can you see me?
I cannot see you. Unfortunately, but I have a sense just from your voice that you are not dressed as I. You know, I have this straw hat, which you need when you're out in the river on a raft, but you sound like you're dressed for a party, like a formal affair, almost like you have a tuxedo on. Am I right?
Oh, I didn't even notice. Yes, I do have a tuxedo. In fact, I'm just teaching a little lecture here, but I will be going out to a very swank affair.
Yeah, where is that located?
I'm going over to a place called East Egg over on Long Island. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Well. I tended to spend more of my time in West Egg.
Oh.
That's a very sort of an old money part of town, isn't it?
Well, the Macalusas, if nothing else, are old money, my old boy.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Anyway, it should be a bully time.
A bully time, indeed. You remind me of something.
Excuse me, I'm just running some champagne through my hair right now. It's getting it's getting frizzy. I'm trying to calm it down.
That'll do the trick. Yes, I've heard of big parties over there at East Egg, but even bigger ones in West Egg.
Yes. Did I say East Egg?
You did say East Egg. That's where some friends of mine, the Buchanans, live. But there's another person who I've always been fascinated with, whose name is James Gatsby, and he lives over in West Egg. So you might want to bop over there.
Well,
he has these parties that last a whole weekend, and they're sort of famous, and you'll be welcome if you just drift on in.
Actually, it's funny that you mentioned that. I was there last weekend.
Really?
The most amazing symphony jazz band was there, and let's just say that the ladies were really flapping.
Yes, it's almost like it's the Roaring Twenties back there.
Yes, it is. It is. In fact, the other day, my wife and I were out riding, and we came across this Jay Gatsby man that you talked about. And I had been at his house, so I was a little embarrassed because I went to his party and never even met the man. But I had a fascinating chat with him.
This is all sounding very familiar.
Yeah.
Well, any of you, I assume your students are here? Are they here?
I think they are. They should be here, yeah.
Okay, well, hello to you all. As I say, I'm still just basking in the pleasures of an earlier part of America, a little quieter time, a time before the modern age, when the fastest mode of transportation was just drifting down a river. But unfortunately,
how Vulgarian of you.
Well, I like to think of it as simpler, simpler and more authentic in a way, and more sane. It's a little bit like this time we're living in right now, just quieted down. But I want to say, for you eager beavers out there who are eagle-eyed and who are ready for another good read when you're done with Huck Finn, you should try out The Great Gatsby. It's a novel that's set in the Roaring Twenties in the greater New York City area, and the things you're learning today in Mr. Macaluso's class are going to be portrayed in that novel in all kinds of color. A marvelous book. And in fact, I'll just say this. Anybody who's interested in AP literature who's signed up for it, that's going to be the book we start with next year.
I concur, Mr. Matson. It's a fabulous read. It's a glittering time.
It's bully, as you say.
Bully time. And, unfortunately, our promenade season is going to be cut short this year. But I think anyone who's missing their prom would do well to read The Great Gatsby to get
absolutely.
The feel for the romance in the air.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, it's almost like a prom between pages.
Exactly. Well,
pleasure visiting.
Yes, Mr. Huck. I guess you got to shove off down the river now.
That's right. I got miles to go.
Okay.
Got to get my friend Jim here to safety somehow.
Okay, I see. I noticed that you've got a side of bacon there in the canoe.
Oh yeah, that's for my dinner.
That does sound like the good life.
Amen.
All right. Well, thanks for calling in.
You betcha.
Bye-bye. Ta-ta, as we say. Huh. That was strange to have Mr. Matson call in like that. Anyway, the department store catalog was part of the 1920s. There's also something else, something called the installment plan. You might have an idea of what this is, but it's a new invention in the 1920s. The idea is You can go to a department store. You all know what a department store, that's a relatively new thing in the 1920s. And if you don't have the money to buy the new frock that you're interested in, you can buy it on installment. They give you the frock and you pay for it in 6 or 7, 8 or 9, whatever the terms are, separate payments. Okay? Now let's think about that. I'd like to call this easy credit. And in the 1920s, consumers, the middle class, is embracing this idea of buying things on credit. Now, think about earlier times. What would Ben Franklin have thought about this? Would Ben Franklin think that you should buy yourself a new anything on credit? No, he would not. You recall that he borrowed some money from a friend once, and he felt nothing but shame for having done so. He eventually paid that guy back. Remember that big scene at the dinner table, I think. But earlier American thinkers like Ben Franklin think that credit is a terrible thing. But here we are, building an economy on credit. And isn't it nice? If you don't have the money, you can buy what you really want. Maybe not what you need, but what you want. Okay? Some of the things that people were buying were new appliances. Okay, so the 1920s is a time of technological improvement. Here's a picture of a radio. The radio is a new invention. And, it's kind of like the iPhone, I guess. When the iPhone came out, 8 or 9 years ago, I remember thinking to myself, oh, that's really cool, but I'll never get one of those. It's so expensive. And probably within the year, not only did I have one, but I felt like I had to have one. That if I didn't have one, I would be somehow missing out, right? Not everyone is susceptible to that. Mr. Hudgens still doesn't have a smartphone, but he's kind of a special guy, right? Most of us are suckers, and we go along with what everyone else is doing. So here I have my iPhone, right? So I'm sure that the radio was expensive, and people weren't sure that they should get one, but after a few months, they decided they had to have one. Okay, now that's one appliance. We also start getting washing machines, electric mixers. We get just all sorts of things that are going to make life easier at home. Vacuum cleaners. And you know how it is. You've lived forever without it, but now that you see that you could have one, you got to get it. Okay? One of these other new things that people want to buy is the Model T Ford. Here's an advertisement from it. I think this advertisement is actually from, no, it's not from Sears Roebuck, but anyway, look at these cars. This is not the first automobile ever made, but it's the first mass-produced automobile ever made. Henry Ford is going to take a luxury good, like an automobile, something that only very wealthy people could afford, and he's going to figure out a way to make it affordable. How does he do that? He does that through what he invents, which we call the assembly line. So instead of having a craftsman or, a handful of craftsmen working on an automobile, a pretty complicated piece of machinery, he breaks it down into distinct steps. And he has the car chassis come out on an assembly line. It moves by the workers, and the workers put the parts on that they're responsible for over and over and over again. So if I'm putting the steering wheel on, I do that maybe 500 times a day, and I get really good at it, and there's a huge increase in productivity. Okay, and when you increase productivity, you can lower prices. So look at the price on these cars. $290 for the touring model, $260 for the runabout. The coupe, $520. That's probably a little faster. And the sedan, $660. Now remember what I said a couple of lectures ago. Your average American is making about $500 a year. So this is still a lot of money, but it's well within reach, especially if there is credit. Okay? So again, this thing that looks like a novelty that you don't really have to have, all of a sudden is going to become a necessity. People are going to stop riding horses to town and start riding horseless carriages to town. Okay, so that's the Model T Ford. All right, now, with all of this economic activity on Main Street. What I mean by that is people are buying and selling things. Presumably you buy and sell things on Main Street. Wall Street is going to have what's called a bull market. Okay? Now, when we say there's a bull market on Wall Street, what does that mean? The opposite of a bull market is a bear market. A bull market is when stock prices are rising. Okay? And if stock prices are rising, that means if you buy stock, chances are you're going to make a profit off of it. Okay? A bear market is when stock prices are falling. Okay? And you can make money that way, but it's tricky, and not everyone knows how to do it. So let's talk about this bull market on Wall Street. Here's the deal. There's easy credit on Wall Street as well. So credit is not just for the consumer, it's also for the investor. Write this down. We get something called buying on margin. Here's what it means. When you buy on margin, as an investor, you can borrow money from your broker to buy stock. And at the time, what you needed was a 10% down payment. So if you have $10, a Wall Street bank or broker will let you buy $100 worth of stock. That means they'll give you a $90 loan, and you buy the stock with it. Now, let's look at how this works. So you see I have a down payment of $10, right? I take out a loan of $90, and I end up buying 10 shares of Coca-Cola stock, right? Each share was worth $10. I have $100. Now the balance of my portfolio, that's the money I have in the stock market, is $100. Okay, now, that's in May of 1920, 100 years ago. Think about that. By May of 1921, let's say that a share of Coca-Cola stock is now worth $20. Now, that's a little bit unrealistic. It is a bull market, but to go up 100% would be remarkable, right? The stock market in the 1920s was generally going up about 20% per year, which is an excellent rate of return. I just used $20 and 100% rate of return just to make things easy. So if that had been the case, and I'm making all of these numbers up, but if that had been the case, those 10 shares of Coca-Cola that I bought for $100, a year later would be worth $200. However, what do I owe the bank? I owe the bank $90. So if I pay the bank off, that leaves me $110 of my own. Now think about that. What did I start off with? Started off with $10, and a year later I have $110. Again, I'm exaggerating the numbers here, but you can see that that is a pretty desirable thing. I've leveraged my $10 to make whatever rate of return there is, not on $10, but on $100. Okay? That's called buying on margin. Does it look familiar? Haven't we seen this a couple of times this year? We saw this in 1819 with people buying land out west, and here we are seeing it again. As I said, the investor now has $110, and what will the investor use that money to do? Well, he's not just going to go out and buy a new Model T Ford. He is going to invest it again in the stock market. But if you have $110, how much money could you borrow? You could borrow about $990, right? So imagine that. In 1921, instead of investing $100 in the stock market, you're investing over $1,000 in the stock market. And if that stock appreciates like it has been, are you going to have a lot more money next year? Of course you are. Okay? The money that you have are what we call paper profits. Okay? Here's what I mean by that. Make sure you understand this. This is important. Your stock market portfolio says that you have thousands of dollars, and you do, but it's all on paper. You don't have cash in hand. You just have a slip of paper that says you have all this money. Now, could you cash that money out of the stock market and have the actual cash in hand? Of course you could. Are you going to? Of course you're not. Why? What do you always want to do with your profit? You want to invest it again in the stock market and make even more money. Okay? Now, you might be asking yourself, what's the use of this? Why have all this money in the stock market if you can't actually spend it? Here's why you might do that. There's something called the wealth effect. Okay? Here's how it works. So if I have money in the stock market, let's say over the last 20 years, I've been investing in the stock market, and I've invested maybe $50,000. Okay, that's my money, $50,000 worth of money over time I've invested in the stock market. However, the stock market has gone up and up and up in value, and now that $50,000 is worth more like $200,000. That money isn't money that I'm touching, but it's money that I know that I have. How does that make me feel? That makes me feel good. And that's called the wealth effect. When I feel like I have a lot of money in the stock market, that encourages me to buy more things. Like, for instance, if I looked at my stock market portfolio today and saw that it had risen quite a bit, I might say to my wife, "Hey, honey, let's go out to dinner tonight." And she might say, "Why? Did you get paid today?" And I'd say, "No, I didn't get paid today, but I looked at the stock market and we're doing really well. Let's go out and have a nice celebratory dinner." Okay? And she would say, "Yeah, of course, that sounds great." And so we'd go out and spend money. Now, is that good for the economy? Of course it is. That restaurant really wants our money. And the fact that we're buying a couple of bottles of champagne makes that restaurant all the more happy. And why are we buying champagne? Well, our stocks are doing so well. So think about that. In the 1920s, more and more people are investing in the stock market. The reason for that is because of buying on margin. So more people are buying more stock. What's that going to do to the value of stock? Stock's going to go up. When stocks go up, what does that make the stockholder feel? The stockholder feels wealthy. What does he do? He goes out to dinner. He buys a new car. He buys a new tennis racket. Whatever. It's all good for the economy. It's a virtuous cycle. Now, the value of the stock market and the real economy are actually two different things. But if businesses are doing well, do people want to buy more stock in those businesses? Of course, they do, right? So as the stock market rises in value, people spend more money. As people spend more money, businesses do better. As businesses do better, people decide to buy more of their stocks. The other thing I have to mention here is this. Let's say I invite my wife out to dinner tonight, and I don't actually have any money in my pocket. It's all in the stock market. It doesn't matter, because what else does the economy provide me? Easy credit. So I just go out to dinner on credit. Doesn't matter, I've got all this money in the stock market. I'll pay off that debt some other time. Okay? So the wealth effect is good for the economy, right? It's great. I'm having a great time. Do I look like I'm happy? I'm super happy. As I said, I'm going out to a party tonight. Anyway, let's move on, shall we? It seems to me like the good times are never going to stop. And maybe because of these good times, I'm not so sure about this, this tends to be a pretty conservative era for some. You know, as I say, I'm going to a fancy party tonight. The women are going to be wearing pretty fancy clothes, much more tightly fitting than in years past. That's not everywhere in the country, but certainly in the more elegant parts, that's true. But there is a kind of conservatism at the time. For one thing, the U.S. gets its first Red Scare. Now, when I say red, what I'm referring to is communism. And of course, during World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution happened in Russia, right? And the communists, or the Bolsheviks, the communists took over Russia, and they're trying to get rid of all classes in society. They don't like the middle class, the bourgeois. They think the bourgeois causes a lot of trouble. They want there to be a classless society, and people in the United States are starting to fear that immigrants from Europe are bringing communist and anarchist ideas to America. And so the Justice Department under these conservative presidents are going to start essentially hunting down people they think are communists and prosecuting them. Now, it's not necessarily constitutional to do that. You're allowed to believe whatever you want to believe in this country, but there's a kind of hysteria about communism. Part of it is that there are some anarchists and communists. For instance, a bomb goes off on Wall Street in the 1920s, killing, I think, a dozen people, and that's blamed on anarchists. It was anarchists. They claimed responsibility. So there's some reason to fear them. On the other hand, this conservative government also doesn't like the idea of labor unions. And communism and labor unions are often linked because communists see, or they believe, that the world should basically be run by the workers. Okay, so they're kind of linked in the public's imagination. We get a lot of nativism in the 1920s. Nativism is this idea that America is only for certain types of people. That is, people who look like us. What do I mean by us? Well, at the time, what we're talking about is basically white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. That is, people who came from Northern European countries a long time ago, like the Pilgrims. And they're Protestant, not Catholic, not Jewish, not Muslim, not Hindu. They're Protestant. They're Northern European. They're white. And they've generally been here for a long time. There'll be an immigration law passed, the Immigration Act of 1924, and it's going to try to limit the amount of certain people who come to the United States. Now, we're living through this kind of period again, aren't we? But, whereas today it might be, people of, Hispanic descent, Muslims, right? People, there's some bias against these groups in America. Back in the 1920s, it was generally Southern Europeans, Italians, Catholics, the Irish. There's a lot of Irish here, but they're going to try to slow that down and prevent non-Protestant types from coming to America. So there's going to be a quota-based system, meaning we'll let as many of one nationality into the country based on a proportion of how many of those people are already here. There's clearly many more Northern European types in America, so there's more Northern European types allowed in during the 1920s. Okay, we get kind of a conflict between rural and urban America during this time period. We see that today as well. Think about these protests that are going on in front of some state capitals. Generally rural people showing up and saying, the pandemic is a hoax, open it up, right? Open things up. Or if the pandemic isn't a hoax, it only affects those urban dwellers who, by the way, in the rural imagination tend to also to be immigrants as well. Okay, so the 1920s, there's this kind of like good old-fashioned rural folk versus a more modern urban folk. Okay, we get prohibition, the constitutional amendment to ban the sale of alcohol. The idea of doing that generally comes from evangelical Protestant, sources, right? They saw these Italian and Catholics coming into the country with a fondness in their culture for alcohol, and they wanted to shut that down. Okay, the Scopes-Monkey trial happens during the 1920s. If you don't remember this, I think a lot of you read the play Inherit the Wind, which is about this trial, and it's basically a trial about whether or not a school can teach evolution, right? And the predominant view amongst, maybe more rural white Anglo-Saxon Protestants is that evolution is also a hoax and should not be taught in schools. Okay, the Ku Klux Klan is resurgent, right? the Ku Klux Klan becomes an equal opportunity hater. That is, they don't just hate black people now. They hate those immigrants. They hate those Catholics. They hate those city dwellers. They basically hate all of these new modern aspects of life. Okay, they want to go back to the old way. Birth control is a new thing during this era, and the KKK thinks that birth control is a terrible, godless idea, right? Again, I mean, I wish we had more time to talk about this stuff, but there you go. So it's a very anti-modern movement. So that brings us to the stock market crash. October 29, 1929. The party is over. All that fun we've been having is gone. All that money I've been making in the stock market, it's gone. What happens? Let's talk about it. It's a complicated story, and my telling of it is going to be simplified. But one of the big causes of the stock market crash of 1929 is the Bank of England decides to raise its interest rates. Do you recall that when we talked about twisting the lion's tail, I said people in America didn't like Great Britain, and one of the reasons was because whenever Britain played with its monetary policy, the rest of the world felt the effects. Well, here's an instance of that. So here's the problem. Wall Street is doing really well, right? It's going up about 20% in value every year. That means investors from around the world want to buy stock in American companies. England is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and so English investors are taking their money out of England and buying American stocks. Okay, the Bank of England at some point decides we got to stop this. We got to stop the flow of English pounds into America. We want that money to come back and be invested in England. So how do you do that? The Bank of England raises interest rates. Okay, now you should know how this works by now. The stock market is paying you 20% a year, right? But is that a given? Can you count on that every single year, or is there some risk involved? There's definitely risk. Okay, if the Bank of England raises its interest rates, that means you can withdraw your money from the American stock market. You've probably made a big profit, and you can put it in the Bank of England, and you can get a guaranteed rate of return on your money. It's not going to be as high as the stock market, but it's also not as risky. So when England or the Bank of England does this, overnight, investors start selling stock. Well, they don't do it overnight because you can't sell stock at night, but you understand what I mean. Almost immediately, they sell stock and start depositing their money in the Bank of England. Well, when investors sell U.S. stocks, what happens to the value of those stocks? The stock prices fall. When stock prices fall, the banks that had been loaning money out to investors, what was that called? Those were called margin loans. The banks call up those people they loan money to, and they say, hey, we want our money back today. Now, if I took out a loan to buy stock with the thought that the value of the stock was going to go up, and it was going to be easy for me to pay off that loan, I'm in trouble now, because all of a sudden, what's happened to the price of the stock? It's gone down. So if I took out a loan of $1,000 to buy stock, my stock is now worth less than $1,000. How am I going to pay that loan back? Well, I'm going to have to sell my stock to cover the loan. But if we're all selling our stock at the same time, what happens to stock prices? They fall. You see? And when stock prices fall even more, what do the banks do? They call in more margin loans. And when they do that, the cycle repeats. Okay? So all of a sudden, this booming stock market is crashing. And it happens essentially in a day. I mean, there are a couple of like shaky days on the stock market. Things would go down, they come back up. But October 29th, 1929 is known as Black Tuesday, and a lot of people lose all of their money. Okay? Now, the stock market crash is not the Great Depression, but it's one of the things that triggers the Great Depression. And let me explain how. So on October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, over 16 million shares are sold on Wall Street. Now, that means nothing to us because we don't know how many shares are normally sold on Wall Street, but usually it's not 16 million. This is a really crazy day. In fact, the ticker tape machines. Ticker tape machine is like kind of like a telegraph that if you ever watch like stock prices, you'll see that they kind of sometimes scroll along the bottom of a screen, like on a financial network, and it'll show, the stock that you own and its price. They used to do that on these ticker tape machines, which were just like a tape of paper that would run through this machine and the prices would get printed on it. On October 29th, those ticker tape machines, they had to run for like 12 hours after the market was closed because the value of things just kept changing. Okay, so in 2 months, stockholders lose $40 billion in paper profits. Imagine that. That's terrible. I mean, to put that in perspective, or not perspective, but to kind of show you what I mean, since the pandemic, my portfolio, not that I have like a ton of money in the stock market, but it has lost a ton of value, right? Like 2 months ago, I would look at it and I'd be like, oh, wow. Hey, honey, let's go out to dinner, right? Today I look at it and I think, oh, it hurts. It's like not nearly as big as it used to be. That stinks, okay? So the wealth effect is gone and the economy screeches to a halt, right? So when my stock portfolio goes down, I decide like, oh, maybe this isn't the time to buy a new car, or maybe it's not the time to start a new business. Okay, so if I'm not buying stuff, people aren't selling stuff, and that's bad for the economy. And if people aren't buying stuff, factories have to lay off workers. And if you lay off workers, those workers lose purchasing power because they're not getting paid. And when they lose purchasing power, more factories close. Right? Now, today, we're thinking more in terms of like restaurants closing, right? Small businesses closing. But on the other hand, there's also like airlines that are in major, major trouble. No one's really, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but so many people have lost their jobs in the last 6 months, 6 weeks rather, that people don't have the money to spend. And when they don't have money to spend, more businesses have to close down. Now, we're living in a strange time. Why are people not spending money now? Well, because they're afraid to go out because of the coronavirus. So it's this kind of strange trigger to what looks like it's going to be maybe another depression, which is a pretty frightening prospect. We get what's called a vicious cycle. As more people lose jobs, they stop spending money, leading to more businesses to close down, which means more people lose jobs and stop spending money. Okay? The unemployment rate hits 25% during the Great Depression. So between 1929 and really the Depression lasts all the way until America goes into World War II. So it's gonna last until like 1941 essentially. So we're talking about over a decade of a really high unemployment rate. Now you guys think that you're bored at home, not going to school. I don't know if you think you're bored. I'm guessing that you're bored. You don't even know it's hard for you to imagine what it's like to be an adult who earns money for his family or her family, all of a sudden not being able to go to work every single day, right? I mean, normally we get up and we go to work and we work 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day, and it's hard, it's challenging, but we feel good about ourselves. If someone takes that away from you, it's hard. Psychologically, it's really hard, and obviously it's just really hard on your family's finances, and a lot of people are going to be ruined by this depression, okay? It's a much more complicated subject than I'm dealing with right here, but hopefully you'll come to class on Friday with some good questions. All right, let me just say one more slide here about Herbert Hoover. Remember I said Herbert Hoover was like the most qualified person to ever become president? There's a problem with this. Herbert Hoover has this laissez-faire idea, and he's kind of handcuffed by that, right? He has this belief. You should write this down. This is a real quote from him. He believes that if the U.S. government gives monetary aid to individuals, the U.S. government will be ruining the souls of rugged individualists, right? Think about this, right? I mean, I think most of us have this psychology. I feel this way all the time. I feel like if I give you a break on a homework assignment that you didn't hand in on time, what will that encourage you to do next time? It'll encourage you to be late again, right? And so we have this idea, it's called moral hazard, where we don't want to like help people out because we think that it'll lead to them becoming lazy, okay? And Herbert Hoover is just, he can't get around that idea. So instead of helping out people individually, I mean, know what our government has done recently. Probably your parents got a check from the IRS because of the economy. And I'm sure none of your parents were like, oh, I better not take it. It'll ruin my soul, right? Instead of helping out individuals, he offers aid to big corporations like railroads and banks. And he hopes that if the government gives money to these big corporations, those corporations will keep their workers working and the money will trickle down into the economy. The problem with that is the following. If you're a big corporation, who do you care more about? Your stockholders or your workers? Usually your stockholders. So instead of keeping people working, companies tend to use that money just to kind of keep the company afloat. Okay, things are so bad that in 1932, there's this incident called the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army is a bunch of World War I vets who were promised a pension by the U.S. government, but that pension wasn't supposed to be paid until, I think, 1947. But when do they need the money? They need the money right now. So they marched to Washington, D.C. There's thousands of them. They actually set up what we call a Hooverville, which is like a shanty town, right on the National Mall. And they're there to like pressure Congress to give them their pension. And Herbert Hoover calls out the U.S. Army. It's actually General Douglas MacArthur, who's going to go on to become famous in World War II. And they forcibly evict these veterans from the mall. Think about that. 1932 is an election year. Does that seem like a good idea to you, to beat up on Army veterans who are just trying to feed their families? Anyway, that's what Herbert Hoover does. Now, in truth, Hoover, by the end of his term, starts to realize, like, okay, the government's got to do a little bit more. In fact, you've all heard of the Hoover Dam. Okay, that was started by Hoover, which is basically a big project to put people to work, but it's too little too late. And in 1932, we're going to have an election, and Herbert Hoover is going to lose in a landslide. And I will wait until my next lecture to let you know who the winner will be, if you don't already know. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed our lecture, and I will see you on Friday. Thanks.